Greetings, thank you for joining us today for our tutorial on loudness and the art of clarity. Delivering successful audio content requires a basic understanding of loudness. Today, we'll be going over how to set up and use the Loudness Radar in Adobe Audition, and the ways in which it will help you deliver consistent, high-quality audio that can be easily heard on any device. This is an intermediate tutorial, so you should have some basic understanding of digital audio workstations before continuing. What exactly is loudness? You may be used to the term volume when you think about how loud or soft the sound is coming from your playback device. The volume on your car stereo, for example, gives you a volume readout as you turn it, with higher numbers corresponding to an increase in volume and lower numbers corresponding to a decrease in volume. As a content creator, I want you to remove this idea from your mind, as it does not describe audio level in a way that's useful for the creation process. We can broadly understand loudness as the listener's perception of audio level over time. In general, the human ear responds to average levels, not peak levels when judging loudness. So, a level meter that accurately describes the loudness over time, as opposed to a momentary peak in loudness, will help us create consistency across our mixes. To visualize this, let's take a look at a standard waveform from any digital audio workstation. While it may seem intimidating if this is new to you, the waveform is easy to understand and will give you a quick visual overview of the audio you are working with. Let's break down what's being described here. From left to right, we have time. Up and down from the center, we have amplitude. The center of the waveform is 0, or no signal. Speech and music are considered complex waveforms, but they can be broken down into their constituent parts. The humble sine wave. Let's take a look at the sine wave. Without all the added complexity of harmonics and phase, we have a very digestible visualization of sound. Time and amplitude recurring periodically. Next time you look at a complex waveform, remember, at its foundation is the sine wave. Okay, back to the complex waveform. From this waveform we can see one very loud peak. But overall, the average level is visualized between these two lines. The transitory amplitudes above those lines are the peak or momentary levels. This average area is what the human ear hears as the overall loudness of sound. So, how do we measure loudness as it relates to the human ear when we are creating audio content? We use a loudness metric called LUFS, or LKFS. LUFS is a standard set by the ITU that is used across the media industry. You will find that the LUFS level recommendation varies between film, TV, music, podcast, etc., but all of the recommendations can be found on the technical specifications pages for each publisher. For example, Netflix has strict compliance standards, so if you were submitting material to them and you didn't adhere to those standards, your film would be rejected. In our case, we're focusing on podcasts, we will use Apple's recommendations, which is to mix to -16 LUFS plus or 1 minus dB of tolerance. It's always a good idea to check the required LUFS level for the medium you are delivering to before starting to mix. Having this standard in place means that listeners will have a nice, consistent sound level through all of the podcasts they consume. No need for them to constantly adjust the volume on their playback device. Just to note, some publishers will loudness normalize the audio you submit to them. For example, Spotify will loudness normalize the music you upload to -14 LUFS. This means that if your song was louder than -14 LUFS, they will apply negative gain on playback, so it will sound different to the original file that you supplied. Now, before we move on, we should clarify the difference between peak normalization and loudness normalization. You're probably familiar with peak normalization. We see here at the top right a peak of about -1.5 dB and a loudness value of -24.4 LUFS. If we were to apply peak normalization, the processor would search for the loudest part of the audio file and then adjust the gain to the level we have set in our peak normalizer settings. Okay, let's apply normalization to this file so we can see the outcome. I'll set the processor to adjust the level to -0.1 dB. After running the peak normalizer, the average level barely moved, as the peak hits -0.1 dB almost immediately. Loudness normalization adjusts the average level to the selected LUFS value. As you can imagine, this could cause serious amounts of distortion as your peaks would now be above 0 dB and clipping. To compensate for this, a brick wall limiter is normally applied during the loudness normalization process. We'll go into great detail about limiters in a future tutorial, but briefly, the limiter stops all audio from exceeding a set threshold. While this may sound like an easy automatic way to get your mix at the LUFS level you want, the limiter can produce some very nasty sounding artifacts if it has to work too hard to contain the peaks, and should always be used carefully. Okay, let's jump back to Audition and take a look at the Loudness Radar. I've got 2 audio files for a podcast. Let's add the Loudness Radar to our project, and then we can monitor our levels. We want to add the Loudness Radar to our master track, as the master track sums together our entire mix for the final output. Click on the master track, and then in the effects panel, click on the arrow and navigate to Special, Loudness Radar. We need to adjust some settings before we get mixing. Click on Settings, and then change the following. Target loudness to -16 LUFS, as recommended by Apple. Set the radar speed to roughly the length of your podcast. In my example, it's 3 minutes, so I will set the speed to the nearest interval, 4 minutes. Set the peak indicator to -1.5 dB true peak. Why do we need to set the true peak level so far below 0? That's a complicated topic that requires an understanding of the audio sampling theorem, but we can just understand it as giving us enough headroom so that we do not create distortion in our file when it's converted to an online distribution file format like MP3 or AAC. In short, never let your audio go above -1.5 dB true peak on the final output, and you will have a great sounding mix on any platform. Some publishers will reject your audio above a certain true peak level, so be sure to be aware of this. Let's take a look at how the Loudness Radar displays information to help us make great mixes. In the bottom right corner, we have the average level, or program loudness. This will be displayed in LUFS or LKFS, depending on your settings. Remember, both of these acronyms mean the same thing. You can see in this example, we're averaging around -16 LUFS. Excellent, right where we want our program level. The outer ring is the short-term level meter, known as the momentary ring. This shows us momentary loudness. We will keep an eye on this for microdynamics. For example, if the momentary level is moving across a large range, the track is very dynamic. If there's very little movement, then overcompression might be happening. In the top right corner, we have the peak meter. If this lights up red, it means we have crossed our true peak level threshold. And in the bottom left corner, we have the Loudness Range, LRA, which lets us know how much dynamic movement there is overall. While there is no set recommendation on what the LRA should be, generally you want an LRA of less than 6 for spoken word podcasts, with high numbers being acceptable for podcasts that have a lot of music or are heavily theatrically based. Finally, we have the radar readout. This will show you the LUFS level across the entire podcast. You'll be able to see any loudness issues you might have from the radar. Fantastic. We've got our Loudness Radar set up and ready to go. Join me in our next tutorial where I will go over some techniques you can use to keep your mix in the target LUFS range. Thank you and see you next time.